This will also give me freedom later on. If I want to change the color, it will be very, very easy. So when working in Photoshop, always try to see the most non-destructive way of creating your different layers of work, whether it's stripes, details, cracks. It's also quite important not to overload the file with too many textures. Some things you just have to merge them in. Now that the pattern is more assembled on the actual texture, I can actually see where the texture is, how things work, if the stripes are all equally distant from each other. So the back pattern was easier for me to actually paint it on rather than having to go to ZBrush and do it, since I already have a pretty good idea of how the layout is. Once I'm happy and I think the stripes look good, I move on to the trousers. In this case, the distortion we had from the straight surface of the bottom folds is much bigger than what we had on the shirt, since it's a much bigger area. So in a similar way like I did with the shirt, I've imported the UV layout, and I'm using it as a guideline to smooth out all the pinching we got on the normal map. The same way as the shirt, once I'm happy with the results, I go back to the AO map, I do the exact same thing using the normal map as a guideline, and then I'm ready to texture. So since this process is the same, I'm just going to skip to when we actually start texturing the trousers. So same rules apply. The first thing is getting the concept art, picking up with the eyedropper the colors I want to use, always using 2 layers. So a first layer with a color or overlay, so we don't get the AO going to black but going to the bluish tone we want, and then another one as multiply, and then playing with the color of both to make sure the final result matches the concept art. Then with a soft airbrush I'll apply highlights where areas of the trousers come out more, and maybe some slight wrinkles, and then I'll do the opposite, increase the darker areas. This will help the trousers pop out more. The shirts will also have the same process later on, but since the trousers are darker, I prefer to start with the trousers to have a good idea of the contrasts. So we can see this almost like the extra support for the AO pass. Since the AO gave us a basic guideline of where the shapes are, but it doesn't pop out the strongest features on the object, and in-game in some situations you might have lighting where the normal map won't do anything, or the lights are just too strong or too weak. So having this contrast going on will help the trousers work on more different situations. Once again, when creating a brighter tone for the folds, I'm creating a group, and in that group I create a mask with the shape for the folds, and then inside that group I apply colors. So all the colors can be easily changed later on, and the value of the brightness and the darkness can all be changed, and they're all being applied in different layers. And then ZBrush, doing the stripes, then getting them back, checking them in max, and then the same way as the shirt, cleaning them up, see where they should be more separate, more together. always as a mask in black and white. And once I'm happy, I apply the tone. Just like the shirt, there are two horizontal stripes on the belt area. And once again, for these, I do not need to go to ZBrush to do them. So I can quickly fix them in Photoshop. But then I notice there's a seam, and this area of the trousers does not have stitches. So to fix this manually would take me ages. In ZBrush it takes 5 minutes, so I'm just quickly placing the mask in ZBrush. I'm gonna fix the seam so it's not noticeable at all, and then I'll just pass it back to Photoshop and it will be perfect. Then I paint the small details that are missing, like the button and the back metal area. And now, before I move on to the shoes, I have the two main areas of the character, which are the trousers and the shirt. And I know that I might have to do some change in the geometry for rigging. So before moving on to the shoes, I'm gonna go in and see if I need to add any extra loops or geometry to support the texturing. So I can see I'm getting a lot of distortion in the bottom of the suspenders. So I'll create two new extra loops that are following the suspenders and will allow for less distortion and for a more three-dimensional and real effect. Also, while doing this kind of operations, I like to use the cut tool and remove edges tool, and do it in a way that I don't have to go back to the UV map to fix it. So by adding and removing edges, the texture itself is not altered, so I don't have to go to Unwrap to do any tweaks. Once I'm happy, I go and I start texturing the shoes. So the process was very similar to the other parts. Fixing normal map, fixing the AO, and now I just want to show the stitching. Once again, I used a very small brush to do the details for the stitches. I could have created a stitch brush, but I quite like the manual look you get when doing the stitches by yourself. Also, I applied a layer style where I get an outer glow of a darker brown tone, so you get the feeling that the stitches are actually pushing the leather of the shoe. Once again, even though this is cartoonish, it's important to have real-life reference of shoes and know where the stitches actually are. So they might be exaggerated and much bigger than what you'd be in real life, but they are in the correct location. So they add realism to the character and make him much more believable. Since this extra detail was created in Photoshop, we don't have normal maps for it, and this is the kind of detail that will actually look slightly better if you do a normal map. So I'll quickly make a height map out of it in black and white, where the white is the highest area and the black the lowest. Quickly jump into Crazy Bump and tweak the values to get a nice effect for the stitches, and then apply this back into Photoshop as an overlay layer on top of the current normal map. I also don't like very much the way the overlay map slightly affects the original normal map, so I usually make a mask for the area that I changed with a slight feather, so only that area will have the new normal map and not the old shoe gets affected by the color changes. Once I'm happy, I create a specular map. I applied some cracks to it because it will help create the idea of leather, and then do some renders with the default shader just to see how it looks. Finally, something I realized I missed was the connections between the different body parts, and I saw that if I want to do changes later on to the stripes or anything else, it will be more useful for me to have the stitching to go exactly at the end of the UV map. So what I do, I'm using the liquefy filter in Photoshop, and I'm pushing the original stitches so they match perfectly where the UV ends. The liquefy is quite interesting because it allows you to save a mesh of the changes you're doing. So once I save this mesh, I can apply it to any other layer. In this case, the AO pass, I'm going to apply the same effect. So once I'm happy and the shirt stitches and the arm stitches are all pushed towards the UV, I'll save this liquefy mesh, and I'll do the same thing for the AO, and it should match perfectly. Then I just have to mask out the areas that I don't want to change, in this case the suspenders, otherwise I'll lose the seam. This will also force me to go back and clean up the stripes because now they do not match anymore with the end of the seams of the clothing. Once I'm happy, I just do a quick review, see any changes that I might have wanted to do what I didn't do, small tweaks, and that should be it for the texturing.